On an ordinary Friday night in a small Boise diner, a former Marine was just trying to keep a promise to his 17-year-old daughter. Dinner, every week, no matter what. Then, 3 uniformed officers walked in. Their laughter was loud, their confidence louder. At the counter, a quiet woman tried to leave, and a hand clamped around her wrist. The room went still. No one moved, not for 5 long seconds. Then the Marine stood up and said 3 calm words. Let her leave. What happened next lasted less than a minute. By morning, he was accused of attacking police, patrol cars were circling his house, and the woman who needed justice had gone silent. Again. But hidden inside a phone video was a sentence that would crack open 3 years of buried complaints. If you were there, would you have stood up? From which city are you listening tonight? Subscribe if stories of courage under pressure matter to you. A dry autumn wind moved through downtown Boise, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and grilled onions from Maple Street Grill, where the neon sign flickered softly against the early evening sky. Inside, the light was warm and forgiving, the kind that made ordinary people look steadier than they felt. Daniel Hayes preferred that kind of light. He was 42, tall and broad-shouldered, with the compact build of a man who had spent years carrying weight that was not always visible. His dark hair was clipped short, flecked faintly with gray at the temples, and a trimmed beard framed a jaw that seemed permanently set, as if bracing against impact. A thin scar cut across his left eyebrow, an old reminder from another country, another life. 5 years ago, a drunk driver had taken his wife on a rain-slick highway outside the city. Since then, Friday dinners with his daughter had become ritual, not luxury. Emma Hayes, 17, sat across from him in the corner booth he always chose, the one that allowed him a clear view of the entrance without turning his head. She had her mother's light brown hair, worn long and straight tonight, and the same sharp green eyes that missed very little. Slim, composed, observant, Emma carried herself with a quiet steadiness that came from growing up faster than she should have. Grief had not hardened her, it had refined her. She noticed the way her father's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly whenever the door chimed. At the counter sat Sarah Whitman, early 30s, tall and slender, with pale skin that seemed almost translucent under the diner lights. Her dark auburn hair was tied in a low, practical knot, a few loose strands brushing against a face that might have been called delicate, if not for the tension etched around her mouth. She wore a simple gray sweater and black slacks, the uniform of someone who preferred invisibility. Her posture was upright but guarded. There was a carefulness about her, as though she had learned that drawing attention carried a cost. The bell above the door chimed sharply. 3 uniformed officers stepped inside. Officer Grant Keller led them, mid-30s, square-jawed, thick neck, sandy hair cropped high and tight, his presence heavy with practiced authority. He had the confident stride of a man accustomed to rooms adjusting around him. Officer Mark Doyle followed, broader in the shoulders, a shaved head and trimmed goatee giving him a perpetually irritated look, though he often masked it with forced humor. The youngest, Officer Lucas Trent, lean and restless, moved with nervous energy, his eyes scanning faces not for threat, but for reaction. They laughed too loudly for the small space. Daniel's posture did not change, but something inside him shifted, an old instinct surfacing. He took a slow sip of coffee and watched without staring. He had spent enough years in the Marine Corps to recognize the difference between camaraderie and dominance. Keller's gaze found Sarah almost immediately. "Well, look who's out alone tonight," Keller said casually as he approached the counter. His tone carried familiarity without permission. Sarah did not turn fully toward him. "Just here for dinner, officer," she replied, voice controlled, each word measured. Doyle leaned against the stool beside her, effectively narrowing her space. Trent hovered behind, blocking the clearest path toward the door. It was subtle, almost rehearsed. Emma felt it before she understood it. The air tightened. She saw her father's jaw flex once.
Keller's voice lowered, losing its casual veneer. "Heard you've been busy filing paperwork lately," he murmured. Sarah's fingers curled slightly around her fork. "I'm not discussing that here," she said, quieter now.
Keller reached out as Sarah stood, his hand closing around her wrist, not violently, not yet, but firmly enough to deny movement. "Relax," he said, smiling without warmth. "We're just talking." The sound in the diner thinned, conversations dimmed. Daniel felt the familiar pull between restraint and response. He had promised himself years ago that he would not let his past dictate his present. He was not that man anymore. He was a father first. But he saw Emma watching him, saw confusion edging toward fear in her eyes, and something older than anger rose in him, a refusal to look away. He stood, slowly, deliberately. His voice, when it came, was level. "Let her leave." Keller turned, assessing him with open dismissal. "Mind your business." Daniel held his ground.
"It became my business when you grabbed her." For a split second, hesitation flickered in Keller's expression, quickly replaced by irritation. He shoved Daniel with both hands. It was a push meant to assert hierarchy, not start a fight. Daniel stepped back exactly one pace, absorbing the force without losing balance. He did not strike. He reached instead, capturing Keller's wrist in a controlled hold and twisting just enough to loosen his grip on Sarah. Doyle lunged forward, but Daniel used a chair to create distance, sliding it sharply into Doyle's path. Trent's hand went to his cuffs, uncertain. "Don't," Daniel warned quietly. The manager, pale and trembling, was already on the phone with 911. Several customers had risen to their feet.
The room had shifted. Witnesses were no longer passive. Daniel released Keller as soon as Sarah stepped free. He did not pursue. He simply stood between her and the officers until other sirens approached in the distance. When uniformed backup entered, Daniel raised his hands calmly. He did not leave. He did not argue. He waited. Across the booth, Emma lowered her phone. She had recorded everything, not for the internet, not for attention, but because she had learned something from her father. Truth disappears quickly when no one preserves it. The fluorescent lights inside the Boise Police Department hummed faintly, casting a cold, colorless glow over beige walls and metal desks. Daniel Hayes sat in a molded plastic chair in interview room 3, hands folded loosely on the table, posture straight but relaxed. He had removed his jacket when instructed, revealing a simple, dark T-shirt stretched across a frame still built like a Marine despite 5 years of civilian life. The scar over his eyebrow caught the sterile light, giving his face a harsher edge than he intended. He kept his breathing steady. Interrogation rooms did not intimidate him. Silence did not unsettle him. What unsettled him was the thought of Emma waiting outside, replaying the night in her mind. Across from him sat Sergeant Linda Alvarez, early 40s, compact and sharp-eyed, with short black hair tucked neatly behind her ears and a pen balanced between precise fingers. Her uniform was immaculate, her expression measured but not hostile. There was a steadiness about her that suggested long years in patrol before earning her stripes. She spoke calmly. "Mr. Hayes, we're reviewing the footage." Her tone implied neither accusation nor apology. Daniel nodded. "I didn't start it." He did not elaborate. He had learned that offering too much invited distortion. In a neighboring room, Emma sat beside a public defender named Thomas Reed, a tall, narrow-shouldered man in his late 30s with wire-rimmed glasses and a permanent crease between his brows from years of overwork. His tie hung slightly crooked, as if he had tied it in a hurry. Reed had known Daniel's late wife from a local volunteer committee years ago. He had come quickly when Emma called. "You did the right thing bringing this," he said quietly as Emma handed over her phone. Emma's hands did not tremble, but her jaw was tight. She had inherited her father's restraint, but not his ability to bury fear. The footage played on a monitor. It showed Keller's hand clearly closing around Sarah's wrist before Daniel moved.
It showed the shove. It showed Daniel stepping back rather than forward. Sergeant Alvarez watched without expression, though her pen paused mid-note. Sarah Whitman was brought in shortly after.
Under the station's harsh lights, she looked paler than before, the auburn of her hair subdued against her gray sweater. Without the diner's ambient warmth, the tension in her posture was more pronounced. She sat across from Captain Robert Mills, a man in his mid-50s with silver threaded through his close-cropped hair and deep lines at the corners of his eyes. Mills carried himself with restrained authority, his uniform pressed flawlessly, his voice low and deliberate. Years in administration had tempered him. He no longer reacted quickly, and that caution had shaped his reputation, fair but distant. "Ms. Whitman," Mills began evenly, "do you wish to file a formal complaint regarding tonight's incident?" Sarah hesitated. Her fingers twisted together in her lap. For a moment, the room felt smaller. "This isn't the first time," she said quietly. The words seemed to weigh more than the air itself. Mills's gaze sharpened, though he did not interrupt. "Are you referring to Officer Keller?" She nodded once. "I filed something 3 months ago. Internal affairs." She swallowed. Nothing happened. Mills leaned back slightly. It was not surprise on his face, but recognition. Daniel, listening from his room through the muffled corridor noise, sensed the shift without hearing the words. After 2 hours of statements and paperwork, Daniel was released. No charges. "For now," Sergeant Alvarez added, though her tone carried no threat. Emma met him in the hallway. She did not hug him. She simply exhaled, and he understood the relief behind it. They drove home in silence through the dim Boise streets. Daniel's pickup truck felt smaller than usual, the air heavier. He glanced at Emma once. "You okay?" She nodded, then opened her phone again. She replayed the footage, this time increasing the volume, isolating background noise. There it was, faint, almost swallowed by the clatter of dishes, Keller's voice close to Sarah's ear. "Internal affairs won't save you this time." Emma froze the frame. She looked at her father. "He said that before you even touched him." Daniel felt something cold settle beneath his ribs. That wasn't arrogance, it was familiarity. Keller had expected no consequences. The next morning, Boise woke to rumors. A brief mention on a local news site described an altercation between a civilian and officers. No details. No video released yet. Daniel was making coffee when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He let it ring once before answering. Silence on the other end. Then a click. Not a threat, just a reminder. By noon, Sarah's decision came through officially. Thomas Reed called with the update. His voice was tight. "She's withdrawing her complaint. She won't testify." Emma stared at the kitchen table as Daniel listened. "Did she say why?" Daniel asked. Reed hesitated. "She said she doesn't feel safe continuing." Daniel ended the call slowly. Outside, a patrol car rolled past their house at an unhurried pace. Emma's eyes met his. She did not ask what they were both thinking. The system had been given its chance to respond. And now, the one person who could confirm everything had stepped back.
By Monday morning, Boise felt smaller than it had on Friday night. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down on rooftops and rumor alike. The local radio station mentioned an altercation involving a former Marine and 3 officers, and by noon the phrase had hardened into something uglier. Ex-Marine assaults police. The video Emma had recorded had not been released publicly. Without it, the narrative bent easily. Daniel heard it in the way the clerk at the hardware store avoided eye contact in the extra beat of silence when he walked into his construction office. He had built Hayes Contracting from scratch after leaving the Corps, framing houses, remodeling kitchens, fixing storm damage, work that required patience more than pride.
Now he felt the old heat rising under his collar, the reflex to confront. He forced it down. Escalation would only feed the story others were writing for him. Emma did not share his restraint. At 17, her calm exterior masked a mind that refused loose ends. She spent the afternoon at their kitchen table with her laptop open, long brown hair falling over one shoulder, green eyes narrowed in concentration. She searched Boise Tribune archives and public court records from the past 3 years. One by one, patterns emerged. 4 women had filed complaints naming Officer Grant Keller. In each case, the complaint had been withdrawn within weeks. The articles were short, clinical, and buried deep in local reporting. Emma printed them, highlighting dates.
They all stopped,
She said quietly, when Daniel returned from work.
every single one.
Daniel read the names carefully. Different neighborhoods, different professions, same outcome. He felt a cold clarity replacing anger. This was not random. The pressure began subtly. On Tuesday afternoon, Daniel's pickup was pulled over for a routine equipment check. The officer, a young patrolman Daniel didn't recognize, was polite but stiff, eyes avoiding direct contact. The inspection lasted 15 minutes. Nothing was found. The message, however, lingered. The following day, a city building inspector arrived unannounced at one of Daniel's renovation sites. The inspector, Harold Bishop, a thin, balding man in his late 50s with nervous hands and a permanently flushed complexion, claimed a complaint had been filed about improper permits. Daniel's paperwork was in order. Bishop left quickly, muttering apologies that sounded rehearsed. At Boise High School, Emma was called into the principal's office. Principal Diane Caldwell, mid-40s, with sharp cheekbones and a tight bun pulled so precisely it seemed symbolic of her discipline, folded her hands on the desk. She was known for strict fairness, having lost a younger brother to gang violence years earlier. Control, for her, was survival. "Emma, there's concern about your involvement in an ongoing investigation," she said evenly. "You recorded officers." Emma met her gaze without flinching. "I recorded a man grabbing a woman who asked to leave." Caldwell's expression softened almost imperceptibly, but policy demanded caution. "Just be careful," she said. That night, Daniel sat on the porch steps with their aging Labrador mix, Rusty, a 12-year-old dog with a graying muzzle and arthritic hips, who had belonged to Emma's mother before the accident. Rusty's amber eyes still held steady loyalty despite the stiffness in his gait. Daniel scratched behind the dog's ears and stared into the dark street. He felt watched, though no patrol car passed. The phone rang at 11:37 p.m. Sarah's name lit up the screen. Her voice trembled despite her effort to sound composed. "They came by my apartment building tonight," she said. "Didn't knock. Just parked outside for an hour." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Did they say anything?" A pause. "Yesterday someone called my office. No name, just, 'Accidents happen.'" The words hung heavy. Sarah inhaled shakily. "I can't do this again." Daniel's tone remained steady. "Talk to a lawyer. Not alone. Not unofficially." He did not promise protection he could not legally provide. He understood fear too well to minimize it. By morning, something shifted. Emma's phone buzzed repeatedly before she even left for school. A friend had sent a link. The diner video, edited but unmistakable, was online. The footage clearly showed Keller initiating contact, the shove, Daniel's controlled response. Within hours, it spread beyond Boise. Comments flooded in. Some supportive, some venomous. But the narrative fractured. At noon, Sergeant Linda Alvarez called Daniel directly. Her voice was measured, but the undertone had changed. "Internal Affairs has opened a formal investigation into Officer Keller," she said. "You may be contacted for additional statements." Daniel absorbed the words without visible reaction, though a tightness eased slightly in his chest. Outside, 2 neighbors stood at their mailboxes discussing the video. One nodded toward Daniel's house, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. For the first time since Friday, the story no longer felt predetermined. By midweek, the city had split itself into quiet camps. Yard conversations lowered when Daniel Hayes walked past, but no one turned away anymore. The leaked video had shifted the ground, yet it had not settled anything. Officer Grant Keller appeared on local television that Thursday evening, standing stiffly in uniform before a line of microphones. Under the bright lights, his square jaw seemed sharper, his sandy hair immaculately trimmed, his blue eyes steady with rehearsed certainty. "I acted within departmental protocol," he stated evenly. The civilian escalated the situation. His tone was controlled, but Daniel recognized the strain beneath it, the tightness in the neck, the way Keller's fingers curled briefly at his sides. Doyle and Trent stood just behind him, faces blank, offering silent confirmation. At Hayes Contracting, Daniel met with Thomas Reed in his modest office overlooking Main Street. Reed had removed his jacket, sleeves rolled unevenly over narrow wrists. The crease between his brows had deepened over the past week. "From this point forward," Reed said, leaning forward over the desk, "you record every interaction, dashcam, phone, everything. No arguments, no raised voices. If they provoke you, you breathe." Daniel nodded. He did not resent the advice. He understood the battlefield had changed. This was not Fallujah. It was paperwork and optics. At Boise High, Emma walked through hallways that no longer felt neutral. Two girls she had known since middle school avoided her gaze. A senior named Caleb Turner, tall, broad-shouldered, with an athlete's easy swagger and a history of minor suspensions for fighting, muttered as she passed, "Should have stayed out of it." Caleb's father had once been arrested for DUI and publicly defended by Keller. Loyalties in Boise ran personal. Emma kept walking. In the library, however, her friend Maya Chen, petite and sharp-eyed with cropped black hair and a quiet, analytical mind, slid into the seat across from her. "You did the right thing," Maya said simply. Emma felt the tension in her chest ease by a fraction. Sarah Whitman spent most evenings now with her curtains drawn. Her apartment, once orderly and minimal, had become cluttered with half-packed boxes. She moved methodically, tall frame bending over cardboard, auburn hair pulled into a tight ponytail. Fear had altered her posture. She flinched at passing headlights. That afternoon she met briefly with a relocation agent, a middle-aged woman named Judith Harper, short, brisk, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob, and a no-nonsense demeanor shaped by decades in property management. "You can break the lease," Judith explained gently. "It'll cost you, but it's legal." Sarah stared at the blank wall of her living room. "I shouldn't have to leave," she whispered, though doubt trembled beneath the words. Captain Robert Mills requested a private meeting with Daniel at the station that Friday morning. Mills sat behind his desk, hands folded, his lined face betraying fatigue more than hostility. Up close, Daniel noticed faint tremors in Mills's right hand, subtle but persistent, the kind that came from age or long-carried stress. "I am not defending Keller," Mills said quietly, "but I cannot act without evidence. Internal affairs requires more than suspicion." His eyes met Daniel's directly. "If there's more, it has to surface properly." Daniel studied him. Mills did not radiate corruption. He radiated caution. A man who had risen through a department by avoiding rash decisions. Daniel left with a complicated impression. The captain was not an ally, but neither was he blind. That afternoon, internal affairs investigators visited Maple Street Grill.
The manager, Carl Benson, a balding man in his late 50s with thick glasses and a habit of wringing his hands when anxious, provided access to archived security footage. Carl had owned the diner for 20 years and prided himself on neutrality. His wife had once served on a police community board. He looked embarrassed handing over the hard drive. "I never thought we'd need these," he muttered. 2 hours later, Sergeant Alvarez called Daniel. Her voice was controlled but edged with something new. Momentum. "We found footage from 2 months ago," she said. "Different night, different woman." The video showed Keller leaning too close to a female patron near the counter, his hand brushing her waist as she tried to step aside.
The woman, blonde, mid-20s, visibly uncomfortable, had left quickly. No complaint had been filed. The interaction had not been reported. Daniel sat heavily on the edge of his kitchen counter after the call ended. Emma watched his face shift as he absorbed the implication. This wasn't an isolated confrontation spiraled out of proportion. It was repetition. Outside, a patrol car drove slowly down their street again, though this time Daniel noticed something else. Another vehicle following at a distance, an unmarked sedan. Pressure lines were forming, invisible but undeniable. By evening, Internal Affairs had formally requested additional statements from past complainants. The pattern was no longer rumor. Rain came down in a thin, steady curtain over Boise that Friday afternoon, turning streetlights into blurred halos and asphalt into dark glass. Daniel Hayes drove home from a job site with both hands steady on the wheel, wipers sweeping in quiet rhythm. He had installed the dash camera 2 days earlier on Thomas Reed's advice. The small black lens mounted near the rearview mirror looked insignificant, but Daniel understood its value. Evidence, not emotion. Internal Affairs had begun collecting statements from former complainants, and word had spread quietly within the department. Officer Grant Keller knew it. Daniel could sense it the way a veteran senses shifting terrain. No announcement, just tension in the air. Keller had not appeared publicly again, but 2 patrol cars had circled Daniel's block twice that week. Half a mile from his house, red and blue lights flared behind Daniel's truck. He exhaled once, calm, and pulled over. Rain streaked across the windshield as Keller approached, hat low over his brow, jaw clenched harder than usual. Up close, Keller's face showed new strain. The confidence from the press conference had thinned, replaced by something brittle. Doyle stood several steps behind him, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Step out of the vehicle," Keller said. Daniel complied without argument, moving slowly, hands visible. Keller circled the truck as if inspecting contraband that did not exist. "We received a report you've been driving aggressively," Keller added, voice edged with challenge. Daniel met his eyes evenly. "That's not accurate." Keller stepped closer, invading personal space. Rain dotted both men's jackets. "You think a camera changes things?" he murmured, glancing briefly toward the dash. "You're still interfering." Daniel felt the old surge in his bloodstream, the instinct to assert dominance, to answer pressure with force. He thought of Emma's face across the kitchen table. He thought of Reed's warning. He kept his tone level. "If there's a citation, write it." For a moment, Keller's composure cracked. He leaned in, voice low enough that Doyle could barely hear. "You're not as clean as you think." Then he stepped back abruptly and scribbled something on his pad. "Verbal warning," he said loudly, though his earlier words carried a different intention. The interaction lasted 12 minutes. The dash camera captured all of it. That evening, Daniel received a call from Sergeant Alvarez. "Officer Keller filed a report," she said carefully. "Claims you threatened him during the stop." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "The footage says otherwise," he replied. Alvarez paused. "Send it to us." Across town, Emma stood outside Sarah Whitman's apartment building, rain soaking through her jacket. Sarah opened the door slowly. Her auburn hair hung loose around her shoulders tonight, framing a face drawn tight with exhaustion. "You shouldn't be here," Sarah whispered. Emma stepped inside anyway. The apartment felt hollow, half-packed boxes stacked against walls like silent witnesses. "You can't leave like this," Emma said. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied. "If you disappear, he wins." Sarah turned away, staring at the rain sliding down her window. "I'm tired," she said. 3 months ago, I filed a complaint. They told me it would be reviewed. Then I started getting pulled over. My supervisor asked if I was creating problems. I thought staying quiet would end it." She faced Emma again, pale skin flushed from stress. "It didn't." Emma moved closer. "My dad didn't start this.
He just stood up. Her eyes held Sarah's. But if he loses control even once, everything flips. They're waiting for that. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Sarah nodded slowly.
"I'll speak again," she said, but not alone. The next morning, Internal Affairs summoned Keller regarding inconsistencies between his traffic stop report and dash footage provided by Daniel. Sergeant Alvarez and a senior investigator, Harold Green, a tall, stooped man in his early 60s with steel gray hair and a face permanently lined from decades in oversight work, reviewed the footage frame by frame. Green had spent 30 years auditing officer conduct after a scandal early in his career had exposed systemic falsifications. He trusted documents less than patterns. "His written statement doesn't match the audio," Green observed quietly. Further review uncovered something more troubling. In an unrelated incident months prior, Keller had logged a suspect's resistance in a report that contradicted body camera timestamps. Minor edits had been made, subtle changes to phrasing that altered the sequence of events. Not dramatic enough to draw immediate scrutiny, but enough to suggest manipulation. When confronted, Keller denied wrongdoing, claiming clerical error. Doyle and Trent offered cautious support, though their voices lacked earlier certainty. That evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table while Emma replayed the dash footage one last time. He felt a strange calm settling over him. The trap had been laid, but not for him. Outside, the rain finally stopped. The Internal Affairs conference room did not resemble a battlefield. Yet Daniel Hayes felt the same controlled stillness he had once carried into briefing tents overseas. The walls were bare, painted a muted gray, a long rectangular table dominating the center beneath fluorescent lights that flattened every expression. Outside the building, Boise moved through an ordinary Tuesday morning, unaware that something foundational inside its police department was about to fracture. Daniel arrived in a dark button-down shirt and clean jeans, beard trimmed, posture upright but relaxed. He looked less like a combat veteran and more like what he had worked hard to become, a contractor, a father. Thomas Reed sat beside him, suit jacket pressed, wire-rimmed glasses glinting faintly as he arranged a legal pad in precise alignment. Reed's narrow face showed fatigue, but his eyes were alert. He had not slept much. Cases like this could define or destroy reputations. Across the table sat Officer Grant Keller. He wore his uniform, though the badge on his chest seemed heavier than usual. His sandy hair was combed sharply to one side, jaw tight, a faint pulse visible at his temple. The controlled arrogance from weeks before had thinned into something strained. Doyle and Trent sat further down the table, silent, their earlier solidarity noticeably subdued. Doyle's shaved head reflected the harsh light. Trent's fingers tapped nervously against his thigh. At the head of the table sat Harold Green and Sergeant Linda Alvarez. Green's steel gray hair was combed straight back, his lined face expressionless but intent. Beside him, Captain Robert Mills maintained a reserved posture, hands folded, eyes unreadable. A small digital recorder rested in the center of the table, its red light already blinking. "Mr. Hayes," Green began evenly, "this is a formal confrontation hearing. We will review all evidence and testimony." Keller leaned forward before Green finished. "Let's be clear," he said sharply. "This man assaulted an officer performing lawful duties." His voice was louder than necessary, filling the room. Daniel did not react. He kept his hands folded loosely. "I intervened when you grabbed her," he replied calmly. Keller scoffed. "You don't get to decide protocol." Reed placed a steady hand on Daniel's arm under the table. A reminder, not restraint. Green nodded toward the monitor mounted on the wall. "Play the footage." Emma's video filled the screen. The diner's warm lighting contrasted starkly with the cold room they now occupied. Keller's hand reaching for Sarah's wrist. The shove. Daniel stepping back before responding. The audio enhancement clearly captured Keller's quiet statement, "Internal Affairs won't save you this time." Silence followed the clip. Doyle shifted in his seat.
Trent avoided eye contact entirely. "Ms. Whitman," Green said. Sarah entered the room, escorted by an IA assistant. She wore a navy blazer over a pale blouse, auburn hair falling in controlled waves around her shoulders.
Though still slender and pale, her posture held more steadiness than before. Fear had not vanished from her face, but resolve had layered over it. She sat, hands clasped together but not trembling. "Officer Keller has approached you prior to the incident at Maple Street?" Green asked. "Yes," Sarah answered clearly. "3 months ago. I filed a complaint. After that, I was stopped twice for no reason. My supervisor was contacted." She inhaled. "And the night at the diner, he told me internal affairs wouldn't save me." Keller interrupted, voice rising. "That's a lie." Green's gaze sharpened. "You will wait your turn." The next presentation involved documentation. Green displayed comparative excerpts from Keller's prior incident reports, including timestamps from body camera footage that did not align with his written narratives. In 3 separate cases involving female civilians, phrasing had been altered to imply resistance or escalation, where video showed none. "Clerical adjustments," Keller insisted, though his voice cracked slightly. Alvarez spoke evenly. "Officer Doyle, when questioned separately this morning, stated he did not witness Mr. Hayes threaten Officer Keller during the traffic stop." Doyle's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. Trent cleared his throat, offering a quiet confirmation of the same. The room's air thickened. Keller's composure fractured. "You're all turning on me over paperwork?" he snapped.
You think this department survives without men who actually enforce the law? Daniel watched him carefully. Rage radiated outward from Keller now, no longer strategic, just raw. Green folded his hands. "Officer Keller, your reports demonstrate a pattern of narrative alteration. Additionally, witness intimidation is under review." Keller stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly against tile. "This is political," he said, voice echoing against the walls. "He played you." The recorder captured everything. Mills finally spoke. His voice remained low but carried authority sharpened by something personal. "Grant, I forwarded concerns about your conduct to Internal Affairs 6 months ago." Keller froze. Mills continued, eyes steady. "They were delayed at the administrative level."
"That delay ends today." The words landed heavier than the suspension order that followed. Harold Green looked directly at Keller. "Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending full investigation." For the first time since this began, Daniel felt the tension inside his chest release. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but something quieter. A line had been crossed, and now it had broken. Keller's shoulders stiffened as uniformed officers entered to escort him out. Doyle and Trent remained seated, silent. The red light on the recorder continued blinking. 3 months later, Boise felt like itself again, though Daniel Hayes understood that nothing ever truly reset. It only recalibrated. Autumn had deepened into early winter, the air thinner and sharper, carrying the scent of wood smoke through residential streets. The headlines had long since moved on, but the consequences remained. Officer Grant Keller had been formally charged with abuse of authority and obstruction of an internal investigation. The court proceedings were underway, deliberate and procedural. Doyle and Trent had accepted disciplinary transfers to smaller districts outside Boise, their names no longer spoken publicly with the same certainty. The department had issued a statement about renewed accountability measures. It read clinical and detached.
Change rarely announced itself with applause. Daniel stood in his driveway that Friday evening adjusting the collar of his flannel shirt, the cold brushing against his trimmed beard. He had not grown softer in the past months, but something inside him had quieted. He worked, he paid bills, he walked rusty, now moving slower with age, the Labrador's gray muzzle nearly white, hips stiff but tail still thumping loyally whenever Emma entered a room. The dog's amber eyes followed Daniel with the steady devotion of a creature who did not measure worth in headlines. Emma emerged from the house wearing a dark green sweater, hair pulled back loosely, her posture confident in a way that had not existed before. The experience had reshaped her without hardening her.
She had started volunteering twice a week at a community legal clinic, filing paperwork and organizing case summaries with the same sharp focus she once applied to school debates. She no longer scrolled through online comments about the case. She had learned the difference between noise and consequence. Across town, Sarah Whitman stood in a modest office painted in soft beige, a small brass plaque near the door reading Idaho Advocacy for Civil Accountability. She had accepted a position there 2 months prior, assisting women who hesitated before filing complaints against authority figures. Her auburn hair was shorter now, cut just above her shoulders, the change subtle but intentional. She wore navy slacks and a cream blouse, sleeves rolled neatly. The fear in her eyes had not vanished entirely, but it no longer dictated her movements. When she spoke to clients, her voice carried a calm steadiness earned through survival rather than theory. Her decision to stay in Boise had been deliberate. Leaving would have been easier. Remaining was braver. That evening, Daniel and Emma returned to Maple Street Grill. The neon sign hummed the same way it always had. Carl Benson, the balding owner with thick glasses, greeted them with a nervous smile that quickly softened into genuine warmth. "Good to see you both," he said simply. No ceremony, no applause, just recognition. They chose the same corner booth. The world did not shift around them this time. A young couple laughed near the window. A truck driver ate alone at the counter.
The room carried ordinary life in steady rhythm. Daniel ordered coffee. Emma studied the menu, though she already knew what she would choose. For a few minutes, they sat without speaking, absorbing the normalcy. Daniel noticed that he no longer scanned the entrance reflexively. Not because he had forgotten, but because he had accepted that vigilance and peace could coexist. Halfway through their meal, Sarah entered the diner. She hesitated for only a moment before approaching their booth. "I didn't want to interrupt," she said, voice composed. Up close, Daniel saw the subtle strength in her expression, no longer bracing, but grounded. Emma smiled first. "You're not interrupting." They spoke briefly, no dramatic gratitude, no declarations, just acknowledgement.
Sarah mentioned a workshop the advocacy group was hosting. Daniel listened, nodding quietly. The conversation felt unforced, like something earned rather than staged. After Sarah left, Emma rested her elbows lightly on the table. The overhead lights cast a soft glow across her face. "Dad," she said, voice quieter than usual, "were you scared?" Daniel did not answer immediately. He considered the question carefully. Fear had visited him many times in his life, on foreign soil, in hospital corridors, in quiet kitchens after midnight. It had followed him into that diner months ago as well. "Yes," he said finally. Emma studied him. "You didn't look scared." Daniel gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "That's the point. Courage isn't about not feeling it." He glanced around the diner, at the clinking glasses and low conversation. "It's about not letting fear decide what you do." Emma leaned back, absorbing the words. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, thin flakes drifting beneath street lamps. The world continued, not louder, not brighter, just steady. Daniel reached for his coffee and felt the warmth settle in his hands. There had been no gunshots, no dramatic rescues, no final confrontation in a parking lot. Just a line drawn quietly and held. And that, he realized, was enough.
Sometimes miracles do not arrive as thunder or blazing light. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in a steady voice that refuses to stay silent, in a hand that chooses restraint over rage, in a heart that stands firm when fear whispers to walk away. Perhaps God does not always part seas. Perhaps He strengthens ordinary people to draw a line and hold it. In our daily lives, we face smaller versions of these moments. In workplaces, schools, families, when silence feels safer than truth. May the Lord give you courage in those moments. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope, leave a comment about a time you chose courage, and subscribe for more stories that remind us faith and strength still matter. May God watch over you and your loved ones tonight.